A truly epic game of chess has just finished between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi in Game 6 of their World Championship match. This was an absolute marathon, 128 moves over 8 hours of play, and it broke the actual record for the longest World Championship game ever. The last game that was played to this length of time was 124 moves between Korchnoi and Karpov way back in 1974. So let's dive right into it now. Magnus opened with d4, and once again we saw this Catalan system coming onto the board. Now Magnus actually played with the move order here, so here he goes pawn to b3. Jan follows with c5, we had dc, bishop captures, and now c4 from Magnus. And after Jan takes on c4, this is where it gets really interesting. Magnus plays queen to c2, so you can't capture here or you lose your bishop. So Jan goes queen to e7 defending, and now a new move from Magnus, knight b to d2, a really nice idea. The bishop's now defended, so this pawn is genuinely on prise, and you can do this. But Magnus obviously had a ton of prep in mind here. I've played these positions before. When you open the A file and the C file like this, bishop comes to b2, you get tons of pressure, especially with the knight coming to c4, bishop here. So I understand why Jan did not even want to entertain this. Instead, after knight b to d2, he went knight to c6, good move developing. Now we had knight takes on c4, and here's a really nice move from Jan. So he's thinking on his feet here. He plays pawn to b5, developing with tempo, forcing that knight away, and now here he plays knight to b4, and after the queen moves away, bishop to b7. So a really nice concept to get the pieces developed there from Jan. We had pawn to a3 now from Magnus, and here again a nice move by Jan. He could have dropped into d5, but where's the knight actually going from there? Instead he drops back to c6, and he's maintaining the tension with the white pieces here, looking at these critical d4 and e5 squares. So even though he blocks the bishop, these pieces are likely to clear at some point, and then his bishop will have his eyes opened. So we had knight to d3 now from Magnus. It might look strange when super GMs play this move, but when you consider this knight here now still has lots of squares it's influencing, whereas black's knight is blocking the bishop and can't move to these squares yet, then it makes sense to try and keep black cramped here. So after knight d3 we had bishop to b6, just getting that bishop out of the way of the attack. Bishop to g5 now from Magnus, logical. Rook f to d8 coming to the open file, and here's a really interesting moment. So Magnus swaps on f6, and Jan could have just taken back with the queen here. Magnus would potentially simplify like this. We'd have pawn takes, and this is really safe for Jan. You know, he's got the rook on the open file already, he's got the bishop pair, the other rook's coming in soon, no issues for him here. But to his credit, he took with the g pawn here actually to keep the position complex, and he felt he could actually press here. So Magnus brings his rook across to the open file, and now Jan jumps the knight into d4. He could have considered e5, then making Magnus think about the e4 move. That would have opened up weaknesses here on f5, d5, you know, for the knights and things. But it would have been a really interesting try, and Jan said afterwards he maybe should have played like that. But okay, knight to d4, not a bad move, opening up the b7 bishop. We had a trade here, bishop recaptures, queen moves away to a2, and now these bishops got exchanged like this. Jan checked on b7, the king dropped back. Note you don't want to go f3 because you start making horrible dark squared weaknesses for the dark squared bishop. So the king drops back to g1 here. We now had queen to e4 from Jan, centralising, queen to c2 from Magnus, and now a5 from Jan, just gaining more queenside space. So rook f to d1 from Magnus, he comes to the open file, king to g7 from Jan, rook to d2 from Magnus, so he's overprotecting things here, and now he really is threatening moves like say queen to c6, exchanging there. So now a really interesting moment in the game. Jan played rook a to c8, but he could have considered a move like b4 with the aim of bringing the bishop into c3 where it will be a monster, and if Magnus takes, and then takes again with the knight, well, now you're running into bishop takes on f2, and after king recaptures, you can take this knight here, and black is better if anyone is. So coming back here, that was an optional shot for Jan to go b4, but instead he went for rook a c8, And again, he's driving an imbalance in the position now because Magnus chops, we have these series of exchanges, and it's created this tense imbalance of 2 rooks against queen. So Jan drops his queen into d5 here, hitting b3, and Magnus goes b4. So Jan goes a4 here. We have pawn to e3 from Magnus, kicking that bishop away. Bishop comes into e5, pawn to h4 now, pawn to h5 in response, king h2. And here Jan plays bishop into b2, hitting this pawn, which looks really logical because you can't take with the knight or your rook drops, and if you take with the rook, then your knight drops. So Magnus here, he played rook to c5, hitting the queen drops into c6, and now there was technically a way that Magnus could come ahead with an advantage here, but it's very long and complicated, so I don't want to go into all that. But it would have started with rook c2, and you start chasing the bishop round, and then potentially bringing the knight to f4, h5, creating mating threats against the king. But Magnus had 3 minutes, he can't calculate all that, and so he played rook to d1 here, now creating a threat of taking the bishop and protecting the rook. So Jan chopped off this pawn here, Magnus took the pawn on b5, and now Jan hit that rook with queen d7. The rook moved away back to c5. We had e5 now from Jan. This pawn starts to look scary coming down the board. Rook to c2 here from Magnus, good move. And now a really strange decision by Jan. He could simply take on b4, and you can't recapture or you're losing your rook. But instead he decided to go for queen d5 first, and then this gave Magnus the moment to play rook d to d2. And now Jan plays queen b3, we have rook to a2 here, and this is actually a key moment because this bishop is now trapped and forced to make a decision. So you could actually take on b4 straight away. If the rook comes across to attack like this, then you can actually take this rook here, because after you capture the queen, pawn recaptures, this is just winning. And if the other rook slides across, well then you take the knight here. White can then take this here, they're also going to win the a4 pawn, but this would have been a better way for Jan to play probably, because then he can still keep pressuring this f2 pawn, and it's harder for White to make progress here. But if we come back to this position here, instead Jan pushed e4, which does get rid of the knight so that he can then pick up the b4 pawn with the queen, but now this pawn has been made weak and Magnus will soon pick that up. So we had knight takes on e4 immediately. If queen captures, then we pick up the bishop here. We had queen to b3 instead, rook a to c2 here, bishop back to f8 now, clearing the way for the a pawn, but in reality this pawn isn't actually going anywhere, and Magnus won't mind if he has to give up a rook for the pawn and the bishop here, because then he can look to make progress with just knight and rook and his pawns. The problem for black here is that his kingside pawns are really a mess, so there's lots of targets there. So knight into c5 now, we had queen back to b5, knight into d3, pawn to a3 now, knight into f4, queen to a5 now, rook to a2 coming in front of the pawn, bishop b4, rook d3, king h6 now from Jan, adding more protection to this pawn and freeing up the queen. We had rook to d1 here from Magnus, queen to a4, rook d to a1, bishop to d6 hitting that knight, and we also note x-raying through to the king here. We had king to g1, queen b3 from Jan, and now Magnus begins a knight maneuver here, bringing it into d4. We had king h7 and now king h2, and possibly this was going to be heading towards a draw here. Say the king had come back, would Magnus have kept shuffling? It's not so easy to make progress. But Jan actually played queen e4 here, allowing Magnus to pick up the pawn on a3, and then taking on h4. And this definitely wasn't the best way to play, because although you've now picked up a pawn here, Magnus now just has a very free hand to improve all of his pieces and start playing against these weaknesses. So I'm going to shuffle through these next few moves. What we'll basically see here is that Magnus just has a free hand to improve his pieces. He does play f3 here, which looks a bit weakening opening this rank, but we'll soon see that that pawn actually comes to f4, and it's not a problem for Magnus's king. So we had some more moves here. Magnus is just slowly improving his pieces here, improving the rooks, improving his knight, and there's very little that Jan can actually do. He's only got this one weakness to really play against, and it's not hard for Magnus to defend that. So we'll play through a few more moves here and see how Magnus began to coordinate, and this is quite an instructive moment coming up now. So we can see that the f5 pawn is attacked, and if we can bring another rook to attack that, it's going to be in trouble. Then this pawn will drop, then this one could be in trouble. So it's getting to quite a critical moment here, and both players are running low on time. So we had rook b5 from Magnus, the bishop dropped back, Magnus attacks it again, it moves away. We had rook b5, the bishop dropped back, and now Magnus picks up this pawn on f5. And after the queen jumps in here to attack this e3 weakness, this is where Magnus spots his opportunity and takes it. He plays rook takes on f7. The king recaptures, Magnus checks on b7 here, and we can see that he's picking up this bishop once the king moves away. And the problem now for black is that Magnus has these 3 pawns in front of the king plus the knight, so the king is completely safe, and it's just easy for white to make tons and tons of improving moves or shuffling moves and put black under pressure, because black is the one now trying to hold on. So I'm going to play through these moves quite quickly. We'll see lots and lots of shuffling here, Magnus remanoeuvring his pieces, probing away at Jan, trying to find a mistake from Jan if he can, and ultimately Magnus wants to push e4, but he doesn't want to rush this break, as we'll see. So the players continue to shuffle, and this is when we start to get towards a more critical position now. So Magnus is looking for his optimal setup, he's shuffling the rook around, brings it to d4, now this knight comes to e2, and we'll soon see now the change in pawn structure. So after queen b1, Magnus finally pushes e4 here, so these pawns are now rolling and the situation is changing. And with some action actually happening on the board, Jan now switches things up. He brings the queen to h1, we have a check here and the king moves away, Magnus moves the rook again, and now Jan plays a check, king moves away, and h4. So he takes the opportunity to get rid of a pair of pawns here, but Magnus still has these connected ones rolling through the centre here. Now technically, according to the table base, this should be a draw as I understand it, but it's very, very difficult for black to hold. So we'll now see how Magnus starts to make progress. So he remanoeuvres the rook and king here, bringing the king to the safety of the short side of the board and improving the rook and knight. And pretty soon Magnus will now get these pawns rolling, as we'll see. Jan continues to check, and now the rook comes to this beautiful d5 square. We have another check here, the king moves away, another check from Magnus, and now he gets these pawns moving. And it's getting really tough for Jan now. So in theory he should play queen b1 here, let's say, and try and keep checking from behind the king. But even then this could well be lost. You know, it's very difficult to hold. Jan jumps into e6 here, and now Magnus has a really nice way to play and improve. He just starts shuffling his pieces up the board, and there's really nothing Jan can do here. So he actually plays pawn to e6 here, because if the queen jumps in and takes, we're running into this fork. So here after e6, Jan tries queen to g6. We had rook to f7 now, and again this is completely lost. If the queen takes here, we go knight g7 check, king takes here, captures, captures, and this is where you have to know your rook and pawn endgames. This one is winning because after, say, king f7, we've got king f5 taking the opposition. So coming back here, after Magnus plays rook f7, Jan tried king d8. We had f5 now from Magnus, queen to g1, and now knight g7 was the final move of the game. Here Jan chucked in the towel after an epic marathon. So to not miss that next recap, click here to subscribe, and see more epic chess games, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.